I'm really curious now if how would you frame in Whiteheadian terms Jung's concept of the self with a capital S?
That's God in Whitehead. And Whitehead has a conception of God as having two poles. God's an actual entity, right? And every actual entity is dipolar. There's a physical and a mental pole. And so God's mental pole is what Whitehead calls the primordial nature of God, and God's physical pole is the consequent nature of God. And so we can think of Jung's idea of the self as a kind of lure that guides the development of the psyche towards greater wholeness, right? Now, in Whitehead's view, in some sense, the whole pluriverse, this pluralistic universe, is occurring inside of God. But God's not, that doesn't mean that God is outside of it. God is just as much in the world as the world is in God. We could describe it either way. But the role that God plays with these two poles, physical and mental pole, is very much analogous to the self, as a kind of lure towards ever deeper, richer harmonization. And this, for Whitehead, would be, again, a cosmological process, that the whole evolutionary arc of the universe is in some sense not determined by, but lured and inspired by this divine harmony. And, Jung was specifically talking about the human psyche when he would refer to the self, but there's a way in which the process of individuation he was describing would allow the human being to become, if not one with the universe, then at least enter into a more intimate relationship with the whole of things. So, process theology, which is what Whitehead's idea of God is often referred to as having inspired, is very much, I think, one of the best ways I've found to spell out the metaphysical and theological implications of Jung's psychology. And I mean, Jung does a pretty good job doing that himself, but Jung's always limited by his hesitance to breach the Kantian sort of epistemological limitations. Jung would always say, I'm just a phenomenologist, and I'm talking about the archetype of the self, but it's totally based on what I've observed in my patients and in myself, and whatever might be going on metaphysically or cosmologically, like, don't ask me. Of course, when he's in a different, more speculative mood, Jung has a ton to say about what's going on beyond just, phenomenology.
He has opinions, but it's more what he would consider personal knowledge from experience, not scientifically.
Science.
Not something that he would consider, science.
I'd love to talk more about Whitehead's conception of God. Something that you mentioned was that Whitehead's God is an actual entity. And I'm curious, does he or would you put labels like infinite or eternal, or like how does Whitehead conceptualize God as both an actual entity or is it like the collection of all actual entities at the same time, or how are actual entities that aren't God and God as an actual entity, how do you relate those things?
Yeah. So, like all actual entities, God is dipolar, like I was saying before. And so there's a sense in which, and there's a ancient tradition of negative theology where paradox and the coincidence of opposites becomes the best means we have for describing the divine nature. And so Whitehead would say that the primordial nature of God is eternal, and the consequent nature of God is temporal. Why is that? Well, the primordial nature is that's the mental pole of God, and that is God providing some valence or order, aesthetic order to the realm of infinite possibilities. And it's that envisagement of possibility, as Whitehead would put it, by the primordial nature of God, that allows for all finite actual occasions to then have some relevant sense of possibility or novelty in each unique situation that they arise within. So that's the role of the primordial nature. The consequent nature then, as the temporal part, and also, Whitehead would say that the primordial nature is alone and one in a sense, whereas the consequent nature is together with the world and is in a sense, the collection of the community of all of the occasions, actual occasions, finite actual occasions that have ever arisen. So the role of the consequent nature is to gather together everything that happens and in some way make that multiplicity harmonious. And so there's this tension between these two poles of God. Whitehead doesn't want there to be two gods, but it's paradoxical to understand how his conception of the divine can be both eternal and historical, how it can be both alone and with the world. He says also that the primordial nature of God is unconscious, and the consequent nature of God becomes conscious because of its relationship with the world. You could think of the primordial nature as just this sort of unconscious yearning that again gives some kind of a structure or creates a hierarchy of value in relationship to infinite possibility. That then informs and lures all the finite actual occasions. But they're not determined by that primordial envisagement. Finite occasions make their own decisions. But whatever they decide, the consequent nature finds a way of harmonizing with that, bringing it back into some sense of ever ongoing unification, right? And so God grows with the world in Whitehead's scheme. Part 5 of Process and Reality is where he lays this out, and it's all of a sudden he goes from part 4, which is all that Mario-topological stuff that's hard to follow, to the most poetic part of the book, which is not as conceptually clear because, again, he's dealing with a mystical experience ultimately that's steeped in, when we try to articulate it, all of these paradoxes and seeming contradictions.
The primordial nature of God feels like, maybe you can correct me here, it feels like infinite possibility space of some kind. Possibilities.
But God is also the sort of principle of limitation on possibility because of the way that the valuation of infinite possibility orders that realm of possibilities, gives it a vector, a valence, a kind of...
Is that a teleology or more like an omega point, like a great attractor of some kind?
Yeah, it's kind of like omega, but interestingly, Teilhard de Chardin has the omega at the end, whereas Whitehead's is kind of at the beginning. But the primordial and consequent natures feed back on one another. So we don't want to think of this as a temporal order, that like the primordial nature is like at the beginning of the universe or something, and the consequent nature is at the end of the universe. I think Whitehead means there's a logical ordering here, but not a temporal ordering. And sometimes in Teilhard's view of the omega point, it seems like a historical order.
I keep thinking of Plato's forms, and especially the Neoplatonist tradition, and the notion of the one and all of the forms as being somehow an emergence or an overflowing of the one. Which I was thinking about earlier, because you were talking about the sort of two different aspects of Whitehead's God, and it made me think of a book called The Great Book, which explores actually a similar tension that's in the historically received philosophical conception of God prevalent in the Abrahamic traditions, to do with, on the one hand, his supposed self-sufficiency, and on the other hand, the overflowingness and the fecundity that in some sense requires other things, but then the whole rationale for it is that it's self-sufficient, doesn't need other things, but similar kind of tension. But I wanted to ask, what because you mentioned that there's an important way that eternal objects differ from Platonic form. What is that important?
Good. Yeah. So in Plato, his eternal forms, his ideas, eidos, which I think is one of the part of the title of your podcast, they are the preeminent realities, the preeminent actualities. The physical world, everything that we experience through our senses for Plato, everything that we feel and perceive is a kind of imitation, a mimicry, a copy. What's that?
A sad one.
A sad copy of the reality, the original, which is often some Platonic heaven. Now, to be fair to Plato, we usually talk about Plato's theory of forms, but Plato wrote. I always say to my students, Plato wrote dialogues, not doctrines.
Exactly.
And all the best refutations of the idea of ideas are also in Plato's dialogues.
Exactly.
So it's a compelling idea. There's a good argument to be had between Platonic realists who think universals pre-exist concrete things, so to speak, and nominalists who think that what we think of as universals are really just names, general categories that we abstract from experiences of particulars. There are ways that I think the nominalist critique of some versions of Platonic realism are important and valid. We want to avoid essentialisms and so on. But at the same time, it's hard to make any sense of mathematics without taking Platonic realism seriously. And so because he was a mathematician, and because he wanted to provide some justification for knowledge, definite knowledge, which presupposes that we can recognize and identify enduring objects across time, Whitehead needed this aspect of his scheme, this category that he calls eternal objects. But unlike Plato's forms, eternal objects, he says they're deficient in actuality. They're not causes of anything. They don't do anything. He has what he calls the ontological principle, which is basically actual occasions are the only reasons, the only causes. All the agency is with the actual occasions of experience and not with the eternal objects. It's the actual occasions that draw upon or ingress the eternal objects. And so this is almost an inversion of Plato. But importantly, in inverting Plato, Whitehead is maintaining the importance of having this category of real ideas, as it were, or that it's not as easy as saying that his eternal objects are just universals, because of course there are particular eternal objects, so we have to be careful with our words here. But he did think it was important and necessary, again, to justify our knowledge, that we be able to make reference to eternal objects. And what that means is that, he gave the example of Cleopatra's Needle, which is in London on the Thames, I believe. Physically speaking, at the molecular and atomic level, the statue is made of marble. I believe that it's constantly losing little bits and gaining other bits, and dirt's accumulating. And so he's like, if we're going to be fussily exact about it, that physical entity, the enduring structure at a material level is never the same twice. It's constantly wasting away. And indeed, in World War, not sure if it was one or two, probably World War II, it was damaged by a bomb, so it's, physically speaking, it's never the same twice, but yet we are able to visit it on multiple occasions throughout our lives and say, oh, there it is again. What is it that we're referring to? Whitehead would say, well, it's this complex eternal object that we're recognizing. that is, yes, abstract, and yet we're also able to recognize it participating in this physical society, to use his term, or nexus. And so that, for Whitehead, is how we salvage the idea of having definite knowledge of enduring things that we can recognize across different occasions of our lives. Because, if we live in a universe that's just awash in process and relationship and nothing is the same twice, it would start to become really difficult to understand how knowledge is possible. How do we have science? How do we make precise measurements? And so that's one of the reasons that Whitehead found it necessary to introduce this category of eternal objects.
I mean, it seems like, due to the nature of what he's proposing, it doesn't lend itself to the sense of a finished system, because what it proposes is a world that is always transcending whatever representational, is always growing, is always adding to itself, becoming novel, and it's hard to see how you could have a complete representational theory of what that's going to look like, when the whole principle is that it's, always kind of becoming something more and something new.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The philosophy should be as open and creative as the universe.
Yeah. I actually have, I guess what you would call it is a summary of what I've understood so far from Process and Reality. And I was kind of hoping maybe I could read it out and you could tell me what you think, and if there's particular aspects that aren't necessarily right, you can give me some pointers, and with that,
sure.
Okay. So there's a little bit of poetic language. That's just a bit of how I write, but well, first of all, do you think it's fair to call the philosophy of organism a sort of phenomenology first metaphysics?
If we mean phenomenology first, if we mean by that it's rooted in experience, sure. But if we mean technically phenomenological and the method that Husserl develops, I think there's some important differences.
No, I mean, specifically what I mean is, I usually think of metaphysics as being to do with the general principles that have to be true in order for what we observe to be the case, I suppose. Yeah, so I suppose the way I see Whitehead's metaphysics is, take as the basic organizing principle in the interiority, the experience, and then kind of make the assumption that that's what everything is like, and then it's like an outworking of that. That's kind of how I.
Yeah, in that sense, that's definitely accurate. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, and think before you start, I just wanted to check in because we've got about 10 minutes left before it's been an hour 45, and just want to check, Matt, how are you going? Like, do you feel like you need to stop soon, or have to go over 10, 15, or how's your belly?
Yeah, I mean, I could go another 15 minutes or so a little past the top of the hour, but definitely I'm getting hungry. So as much as I'm enjoying this, my coherence will start to diminish pretty soon.
No doubt.
That's fair. Yeah, well, we can organize another chat if you're open to that. I'd love to.
Oh yeah, of course.
There's so many more questions. It feels hard to fit everything in.
I feel like we've only just started to scratch the surface,
Yeah.
Well, happy to do a part 2 and a part 3 and onward forever. Cool. As long as I last. So.
Yeah, so this is what I came up with. The universe is ultimately a process, not a thing, and the nature of that process is the perpetual realization of complexity in service to the evolution of novelty. That the heartbeat of existence consists in the moment of unification, which is occasioned by the inclusion of every entity, actual or not, in the concrescence whereby one is added to the sum, which with each beat of the heart of existence, the prior superject is assimilated and immortalized by the new. The subject becomes an object to the new subject, and in this way each prior state accrues and contributes to the current pinnacle of novelty. And I guess as a kind of, I guess I think of concrescence as almost like a moment of crystallization. And I wonder, like, is there an in-between? Yeah, this is part of a question I think that's been developing throughout the conversation in my mind is, is it a succession of actual occasions, or is, because I kind of am in some sense oscillating myself between a picture of it where it oscillates between concrescence and some intermediary state. I don't know what that would be though, right? Which is like where the concrescence dies and passes away and becomes the formation state for a new concrescence. But I almost get the sense that there's no gap in there, space to breathe there, that the concrescence dies at the moment that it becomes a new concrescence or something like that. So yeah, I'm curious how that landed with you.
These are the sorts of questions. I mean, first of all, your description you read was beautiful. Admirably put. I wish I had written it. But this is one of the questions that you raised that I think Whiteheadian scholars dig into and disagree with each other about. It's a fertile area of research. Whitehead himself does note, he describes two different types of process. Concrescence is one and transition is the other. And, he says, this is an intellectual analysis of an unbroken process of becoming. And so let us not mistake the order of explanation. Like for him, the concrete always explains the abstract and not the reverse. That said, he, in describing these two types of process, is trying to do justice both to the importance of individuals, the microcosm, as it were, and the way that the universe becomes unique in each particular. But he also wants to do justice, and I think this is where the process of transition becomes important, to the macrocosmic, to not just the individual, but the universal, not just each, but all. And transition is the process whereby what was just unified now becomes one of the many again. And so we need to distinguish between these two types of process. And we don't want to get in the mistake of imagining that what's being described here is a spatio-temporal kind of movement, right, where there might be like empty space between this concrescence here and this concrescence there.
Oh no.
Yeah, I know you weren't implying that, but it's easy for us to imagine that that's what we're trying to talk about here.
Yeah, actually, the metaphor that comes to mind is breathing. Beating the heart is another one, but breathing, the in-out, expansion, contraction, because it strikes me that the unification into the one that it happens in the moment of concrescence is, I don't know, that strikes me as contraction. And then the kind of becoming again one of the many strikes me as expansion.
Beautiful. Yeah. That is a breathing process. Yeah.
I'm curious, Matt, how your ideas of today have moved past or through Whitehead and like where you maybe disagree now, or that you've sort of changed your mind about different things.
I don't know that I could do better. I'm not about to like write my own version of process and reality with my, actually I could do better with my own metaphysical scheme. But I hold Whitehead's categories lightly, as he himself did, right? But I think with him, and I think with other thinkers, I mean, probably, the German idealist Friedrich Schelling is also an important influence on me, and is, quite convergent with Whitehead. A few hundred years, well, about 100 years before, 150 or so before Whitehead, with his very evolutionary cosmological vision. And I have so many important teachers, and when I try to think about what I think, it's hard to differentiate what's my idea versus the influences I've had. But I think for me,
what if we frame it using the concept of development? Not so much say coming up with something new, but in what way have you carried it forward? Say,
sure. Well, as I enter into my final, late 30s and get older and, turn towards the second half of life, I'm beginning to feel a transition in my own development in my own thinking from being, mostly concerned and interested in the natural sciences and interested in more abstract metaphysical integrations of all the special sciences. And I'm increasingly interested in the human being and in these questions of meaning in life. And I've been finding, if not answers, at least interesting questions to help me explore, like what is the human being? What is the meaning of our existence in various sort of esoteric traditions, like anthroposophy, for example, coming out of the work of Rudolf Steiner, who in a way is inheriting German idealism and taking it further. And, just to give one example of the way in which I think we're at this evolutionary bottleneck moment as a species, and the secular materialist story of technological progress and consumer capitalism is like the be all and end all, the end of history, as Fukuyama said. Like that, seems like that was it in the 90s, and then for the last couple of decades, that has totally collapsed, and nothing new has emerged to replace it. And so these questions of human meaning and how we are to rediscover a more viable, like deep motivational structure to guide our existence, and to understand what are the further reaches of human evolution, like where are we headed? To think that we're the pinnacle of evolution, I think is naive. But at the same time, I feel like we do have a unique potential as human beings. As the Buddhists would say, it's an auspicious occasion to be incarnated as a human being. And so what are we capable of? These are the questions I'm interested in. What sorts of transpersonal development lie ahead for us, and in what ways can we consciously decide to take action so as to further that process along? And so that has, to me, that less to do with like understanding all the knowledge that's available and trying to integrate it, which is what it's what I'm still very interested in that. But knowledge seems, when I look at the trajectory of my own life and the fact that I'm going to die one day, human mortality, any answer to the meaning of life has to reckon with that inevitability. Knowledge and intellectual understanding seems less and less valuable.
Right.
Right.
There's actually, I have an essay called True Philosophy, where I talk about a distinction that I make between living and dead philosophy. And in the essay, I use a quote that I wanted to read out. It's from Kierkegaard, but it really resonates with what you were just saying. What I really need is to get clear about what I am to do, not what I must know, except insofar as knowledge must precede every act. What matters is to find my purpose, to see what it really is that God wills that I shall do. The crucial thing is to find a truth that is truth for me, to find the idea for which I am willing to live and die. Of what use would it be to me to discover a so-called objective truth, to work through the philosophical systems so that I could, if asked, make critical judgments about them, could point out the fallacies in each system? Of what use would it be to me to develop a theory of the state, getting details from various sources and combining them into a whole, and constructing a world I did not live in, but merely held up for others to see?
Love that. Yeah.
There's something that was in that passage that brought up a question for me. It was about finding answers from God. And we talked earlier about in Whitehead's view, God having this kind of hierarchy of value and this, teleology or some kind of guidance. And I'm curious if you feel like you've received guidance from Whitehead's work in that specific way of like finding, some kind of, I don't know, enlightenment or some kind of guide towards what a human being is, purpose on Earth is to do. And does Whitehead get explicit with that kind of thing, or have you kind of pulled that out yourself from his work?
Yeah. What I just wanted to quickly expand on the question and say, it doesn't have to be necessarily something that Whitehead, I think, is explicit about. I'd be interested as well if there's something that you have derived in terms of applying Whitehead's ideas of relating to the world in your own life, whether that's been fruitful for you in some way in that respect.
Yeah, that's a great question to have arrived at after 2 hours of getting into all the metaphysical minutiae. I will quote Whitehead first before I talk about how it's affected my personal experience, because he says in his book Adventures of Ideas, he says the teleology of the universe is directed to the production of beauty. And so his conception of the divine is as the ultimate aesthete. It's an aesthetic vision that the divine is trying to realize, and morality is a subset of aesthetics. Whitehead says God seeks intensity of experience. God does not seek to preserve already established modes of experience, but to push us further, or lure, I should say, to pull us, beckon us forward. And also, not only is morality a subset of aesthetics for Whitehead, but so is logic. This is one of the preeminent mathematical logicians in the world, and maybe world history, saying that logic is a subset of aesthetics. So there's an aesthetic order to the universe, and moral and mathematical forms of order are outgrowths of that. Maths is music in a sense. And, how this affects me personally, I find it deeply inspiring. And I've been on a journey in my life from the kind of less, I would say, overly restrictive form of Christianity and Judaism, at least my grandparents on my dad's side, and Christianity coming from my mom, and became a pretty obnoxious materialist atheist in my teens, and then discovered the psychology of religion and through Carl Jung, and read some Alan Watts, and got interested in Buddhism and Taoism and Zen, but then, as I went through my 20s, had some experiences and started to think more deeply about the importance of personal type of divinity, and all of a sudden, in studying like esoteric and mystical forms of Christianity, this whole idea of incarnation started to resonate with me more deeply than it had before. And so Whitehead's idea of God as he puts it, the fellow sufferer who understands, just touched me in a way. This isn't, Whitehead's God is not omnipotent anymore, and not above the world, ruling it with, decrees as some kind of a dictator, but rather involved with the world, feeling the pain and the joy of every occasion of experience, and trying to offer some sense of what's possible. And that feels to me like it's not just a description of my experience, but it seems adequate as a description of my experience, but it's also an invitation to give expression to experience so as to further the vision he's providing, right? So there's like a participatory element to it, and there's a sense in which he's saying God needs our help, and I find that compelling.
Yeah.
For some people, they're like, I want God to be in charge and like make it all okay. I'm like, that's such a boring inadequate way of understanding human life. Like, what's there for us to do if God's already in charge? And why should there be evil? I mean, if God's actually omnipotent, then I'm fucking pissed at that God.
Yeah.
That's really beautifully put. And it kind of makes me think that we're all gods in the making, and God wants allies rather than
Yes.
slaves or worshippers.
Right. That's well
Maybe
said.
Yeah. Well,
maybe.
sorry.
Sorry, go on and sing.
I just wanted to say, I lost the phrasing for a second, but I was thinking the same thing. I was specifically thinking that, it's almost like God is trying to nurture us towards being co-creators,
Right. Right. Not jealously guarding power, but saying,
Yeah.
here, like, let's do this.
Mm.
Yeah, that just gave me goosebumps. So